humans could write, they began writing scripture, chanting, mantra, whatever they could to try to remember these wonderful teachings. And so, whether it's etched in stone or written on a scroll, some of the teachings have been passed down from generation to generation along the golden chain, from teacher to student, and then somehow trickling its way down to us modern-day yogis and yoginis. So tonight I'd like to introduce some of these texts to you in hopes that you may pick up one of them and read them and allow yourself to go a little bit deeper into the study, the philosophy, the teachings, and the technology behind the yoga asana and yoga breathwork. So let's take a look at our first text here, the Ridge Veda. So coming over here to our first text, there's many translations of this wonderful ancient classic yoga text. And this is one of the oldest documents that we have on earth, the Ridge Veda. And about this time in history, about 5,000 years ago, yoga technology was just being developed in India. Vedic civilization was growing and developing systems of thought. And this book was written down and later on translated into different languages and dispersed along the world. And so this is available to us, the Ridge Veda, one of the more intricate and harder to read texts, but definitely very rewarding, and describes where the roots of yoga come from in the Vedic tradition of India. Right, the next book I'd like to introduce to you comes in again, these are many different translations of the book. And the book may look different than this to you when you find it. Okay, so this is a common translation by Eknath S. Warren. And this is the Upanishads. Okay? Around this time in history, yoga was starting to become systemized in thought and somewhat in practice, but mostly in thought. And most of us know that yoga stems from Ayurveda. Ayurvedic medicine stems from Vedic history, and therefore we're tracing the roots of the yoga philosophy and theology back through the Vedic tradition of India. Okay? Moving along to our next text that I'd like to introduce to you this evening. This text is the Bhagavad Gita, and again, coming in many forms. This is a classical yoga text and discusses a very intimate and particular relationship that the yogi has with practice, with the practice itself. So if you really want to get into a personal kind of fictional story about yoga, the Bhagavad Gita can provide some of those basic understandings. Okay? Let's move next to one of my favorites. It's a very short and good reading here called the Hatha Yoga Pratapika. And this book is a wonderful short classic book developed later than the Gita and the Upanishads, but somewhat close to that time. And this is when yoga is not only starting to be systemized in thought, but now starting to be systemized in practice. So the Hatha Yoga Pratapika starts to lay down the very basic foundation for yoga practice, starting with asana, breath work, mudra, and mantra. So here's where we start to really see the yoga poses coming into text form. Okay? Let's go on to our next couple of texts that I really love for modern day study. This one is called the Yoga Mala, and it's by Sri K. Patabi Joyce, who's one of our living yoga masters, living in Mysore, India, and running the Ashtanga Yoga Learning Center there. He is a master of Ashtanga Yoga, and his teacher, Krishnamacharya, is one of our, is famous for teaching most of our Western yogis today. Okay? And then last but not least on my bookshelf tonight, I have BKS Iyengar's book, Light on Life. This is a recent classic. And what I mean by that, this book will never go out of style. This is a wonderful, wonderful book. I can't recommend it more. And it really brings a lighthearted look to the life and lifestyle of the modern yogi and how yoga is used as a therapeutic approach and application towards one's lifestyle. So these are some texts for you to enjoy. And just to review, let's go through them once again. You might want to get out your little pen and paper so that you can write down some of these titles. So beginning way back in the beginning, 5,000 years ago, we have the Ridge Veda. Wonderful classic. Comes in all forms with many, many, many translations. The Ridge Veda. Next, we're moving on. Upanishads. As the theology and philosophy of yoga becomes codified, we start to see systemization in thought and principle, and we find the Upanishads coming into existence. And then moving on to the very personal story of Arjuna and Krishna in the decision man or woman facing this challenge called life, the Bhagavad Gita. Wonderful, wonderful personal tale of yoga at its best. Okay? Next, the Hatha Yoga Pratapika codifies the very basic steps of yoga asana, pranayama, mantra, and mudra. The very basic systemization of the physical practice of yoga as opposed to the philosophical practice that we see back in the Upanishads. And then today's recent text that you can find out there from living yoga masters, we have the Yoga Mala by Pratapika Joyce, and we have Iyengar's Light on Life. Both of these texts wonderful for exploring the modern yoga practice. I highly encourage you to pick up one of these and to investigate them more. Okay? So what does studying yoga texts and scripture have to offer you? Well, one thing that you can imagine is that it allows your mind to get involved. And the mind is 90%, yoga is 90% a mental activity. So we really need to kind of keep rehashing out the yoga principles and the yoga philosophy and the yoga theology behind the action so that the action is filled with right intention. So the action is filled with as the Buddha would say, right action, right words, right concentration. And so in order to get the mindset into a place where yoga can really happen, it needs a lot of work. It needs a lot of mental asana. And this is what the Upanishads, the Hatha Yoga Pratapika, and texts like the Bhagavad Gita and the Ridge Veda offer us. They offer us mental asana, places to put our mind into a space where we can contemplate the truth of that action. So that's where yoga studying comes in very helpful for us. And it is a part of the practice. Not only studying ourselves and looking deep inside to find out what really, really feels good to us, what really brings us happiness, what thoughts, words, actions, books, studies, practices, poses really create benefit and happiness in our lives. Okay? So if you've never explored these texts, let's take a look at them now and see if we can share a couple of great things from each one of these. We'll start from the Ridge Veda. Ridge Veda, being one of the oldest texts on earth, describes in sort of poetic form the very basics of yogic thought. And it can be a pretty scholarly read. You can either just open it up and read from it, or start from the beginning and find your way through. Okay? So let's see if we can find little piece in the beginning to share with you here. Okay. The Ridge Veda refers to many different theories of creation. Several of these regard creation as the result, often apparently a mere byproduct, of a cosmic battle, such as those mentioned in the hymns of Indra, or as a result of the apparently unmotivated act of separating heaven and earth, an act attributed to several different gods. These aspects of creation are woven in and out of the hymns in the older parts of the Ridge Veda. But in the subsequent 10th book, we encounter for the first time hymns that are entirely devoted to the speculations on the origins of the cosmos. So some of the hymns seek the origins of the existence itself, or of the Creator himself. Others speculate upon the sacrifice as the origin of the earth and the people in it, or upon the origins of the sacrifice. Sacrifice is central to many concepts of creation, particularly to those explicitly linked to sacrificial gods or instruments, but it also appears as a supplement to other forms of creation, such as sculpture or anthropomorphic birth. So the Ridge Veda, very, very deep piece of work contemplating the origins of existence and the universe itself. Kind of sounds like Genesis, doesn't it? Good. So maybe another perspective on that wise truth. In the Upanishads, again, many different translations, many different views on this text. The Upanishads are a wonderful, another kind of essay and poetic type of book. And this really dives into consciousness and spiritual life. Life is energy, life is consciousness, and this thing called being human or human being. Okay? This is the beginning of the systemization of yoga. We see in the Upanishads as it goes through what the general yogic thought is on how one should be and act and arrive at a yogic contemplation. Oh, introducing a little of the Upanishads. Toward the midpoint of life's way, as Dante says, I reached what proved a crisis. Everything I had lived for, literature, music, writing, good friends, the joys of teaching, had ceased to satisfy. Not that my enjoyment of these things was less. In fact, I had every innocent source of joy the world offered. But I found myself thirsting for something more, much more, without knowing what or why. Eknath Easwaran goes on to write that he was on a college campus at the time, well trained in the world of books, but he wanted to know what human beings had learned about life and death. He found himself systematically mining the stacks in areas he'd never been interested in before: science and theology, philosophy, psychology, religion. India, as well as British in those days. And the books available confirmed that his education had been taken for granted. Anything worth pursuing was best represented in the records of Western civilization. A colleague in the psychology department found his name on the checkout card of a volume of books written by William James and grew suspicious. Everyone likes a chance to play Sherlock Holmes. See here, he said, you're in English literature, but I find you've been taking home every significant contribution to my field. Just what are you up to? How could I tell a distinguished professor that I was searching for the meaning of life? So, just from the editor, translator himself, a little bit about what the Upanishads can mean for the reader. A deep exploration into the meaning of human existence and the meaning of life itself for the human being. So a little bit refined philosophy and theology on the Ridge Veda. Let's move on to the Bhagavad Gita, one of my favorites of all yoga scripture and text. The Bhagavad Gita is a story of a man, his name is Arjuna, and he is a wonderful prince, accompanied by Lord Krishna through the center of a war, where all the world is at war. And as Arjuna and Krishna come in their chariot approaching the war, Lord Krishna stops time for 7 seconds and allows Arjuna to converse with him and ask him questions about the meaning of life and the meaning of action, right and wrong action, as they go into this war. And in these times, these may be some questions that are still relevant to us as human beings. And so reading the Bhagavad Gita can help us kind of contemplate mentally the meaning of our own world as it kind of goes into this chaotic period of time. So opening the Bhagavad Gita, let's take a look at this and see what Arjuna and Krishna are saying to each other here. So here Krishna is saying to Arjuna, as he questions what is needed, why fighting is necessary, or why action may be necessary even in indescribably horrific times. And Arjuna writes, or Krishna writes, the material body of the indestructible, immeasurable, and eternal living entity is sure to come to an end. Therefore, fight, O descendant of Bharata. And he's not saying here, to go to war. What he's saying is that life is a personal choice to move forward or to stand still. And as Einstein said, that which is not moving is stagnant and therefore dies. So he's talking about stepping up to each day as it's a challenge, and instead of backing down, getting yourself up there and fighting for what you believe in. And sometimes that can become very, very hard to discern. Okay? So the Bhagavad Gita, wonderful, wonderful text for you. The Hatha Yoga Pratapika. Here's where we start to see the asana, yoga asana, becoming a central part of the yoga practice. Ayurvedic medicine at this time is starting to centrally get involved with diet, posture, and ways that we can therapeutically help the practitioner to resolve some of the ailments and illnesses within themselves. So as we take a look inside the Hatha Yoga Pratapika, a very short book, it says things like sun salutation to Shiva, who expounded the knowledge of Hatha Yoga, which like a staircase leads the aspirant to the high pinnacle Raja Yoga. He goes on to say details about using the navel as a center point in the breath, thus getting highest intelligence by awakening the Kundalini, the Shakti within. He talks about proper posture and where to place the hands, the heels, the gaze, the legs, the arms in postures such as Siddhasana and Padmasana. He goes on to describe the very basic yoga postures, yoga diet, yoga breath, and just reading a little piece here, he says about Satali breathing, the cooling breath that we use as we make an O shape in our mouth and then breathe through the open mouth. So in the Hatha Yoga Pratapika, it says, as in the above breath, the tongue shall be protruded a little out of the lips where the air is drawn in. It is kept confined as before and then expelled slowly through the nostrils. In the Satali breath, this breath will cure colic, enlarged spleen, fever, disorders of bile, hunger, thirst, and counteracts poisons. So he's talking about the therapeutic uses of each pose, and this is where we start to really see yoga asana and yoga pranayama and the physical techniques of yoga being brought into a system and codified way. Next, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, although I don't have a copy of it here with me today, it's a very important text to mention. The Yoga Sutras is the modern day Bible for yoga practitioners. So we look to the Yoga Sutras written by Patanjali, and you can find the Yoga Sutras virtually anywhere and read all through them, and they go a little bit deeper into explaining the codified system of Hatha yoga, or the physical aspects of yoga that can bring you to the deeper energetic and more spiritual aspects of yoga. Okay, our last two books that I'd like to just review with you: Yoga Mala by Sri K. Patabi Joyce. Fabulous, 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 fabulous read. Okay, Patabi Joyce goes through to show us wonderful pictures and descriptions of him performing the poses and giving details about each one of these poses as he goes through them, as to their form, their function, their history, the method, the benefits of each one of these basic yoga postures that are used in what's called the primary, secondary, and tertiary series of yoga. So a very wonderful read for those of you that are interested in taking on yoga asana as a practice in your life. A must read. And last but not least, again, one of my favorites, highly recommended, is BKS Iyengar's Light on Life. So this takes yoga to a higher level, from taking it from the body into the mind, the spirit, and the soul. Light on Life tells a little bit about Iyengar's journey from dis-ease to complete joy and happiness, using yoga as his tool for transformation to a life that's happy, healthy, and holy. So just opening up a little book, I'd like to read to you a little bit from his book, Light on Life. And he writes, "Remember that yoga is not asking us to refrain from enjoyment. Draw in the exquisite fragrance of the flower. Yoga is against bondage. Bondage is being tied to patterns of behavior from which we cannot withdraw. Repetition leads to boredom, and eventually boredom is a form of torture. So yoga says keep the freshness, keep pristine, keep the virginity of sensitivity. By all means, as I have suggested, keep an eye on our capricious ego, but there are techniques beyond that.